I think it's quite appropriate that Janaki Lenin is going to end this discussion by talking about snakes, by letting snakes into the paradise of law, of simplicity, of squares and triangles, and the neatness of Newtonian hygiene. What happens to such a paradise of order when you let in the lawlessness of snakes? Janaki Lenin, who's a freelance journalist, who writes about wildlife and conservation, and her work is focused on human-animal conflict, particularly on cohabitation with elephants, leopards, crocodiles, and especially the gharial. Thank you, Janaki.
Thanks. No, this is good. Yeah? Okay. When Ravi asked me to give a talk, he said the topic was visualizing the local, and I don't think he suspected I would take it so literally. So, so when there is confrontation between humans and wildlife, the causes that are mentioned are usually loss of habitat, forests are being destroyed, there's a depletion of prey, and that is why wild animals come and exploit humans. But this may be true for lots of species that are very finicky about their requirements. They need very specific temperature range in which to survive, or very specific dietary needs. But there are a whole range of other species that love us. And snakes indirectly love us because our habits, our lifestyles encourage rodents, and snakes love rodents. And they have learned over the centuries, millennia, to live with people. And our religious, cultural stories, myths, reflect that long history of shared spaces. In Hinduism, you have Shiva, the ultimate snake freak. He's got snakes everywhere on his body. You've got Vishnu reclining on a massive snake. And in Buddhism and Jainism, you have the Buddha and Mahavira being shaded by a 5-headed snake. So it runs through South Asian iconography. But it's not always a force of good or of benignness. It's also a force of evil, like, for instance, this monster snake that Krishna kills as a child and dances on it like it's some kind of dance platform. So this really is a reflection of our own ambivalence towards snakes. We don't know what to make of them, and they are perhaps the one species that we elicits the most diverse range of emotions from us. Everything from revulsion, fear, hatred, love. I mean, there's a whole range of people. They have to be psychologically examined for why they love snakes, because it goes so against every other. I see someone just cringing at the thought. So. And by doing that, they are breaking this boundary we've set up between nature and culture. They sneak into our nations. They are not creatures purely of the forest, purely of nature that's out there. They are also creatures of civilization. So, and this is not a new phenomenon, because back in the 12th century, there was this bhakti poet in Canada called Basavanna, who wrote this beautiful poem. It could be as true for how we relate to snakes today. He says, when they see a serpent carved in stone, they pour milk on it. If a real serpent comes, they say, kill, kill. Right? Doesn't that sum up what we do today? But in recent decades, that whole thought process has changed. We've now got a whole group of mostly young men in almost every town and city who will respond to a call if you have a snake, you call this number, and he will come and remove the snake, and the snake is released unharmed into some forest, and people are saved, snakes are saved, everyone lives happily ever after. But that's not what happens. So it's only in recent years with research we are finding out that snakes have a home. They have they have a mental map of the area they inhabit. They know where to get water. They know where to go and bask because they need specific spots. If something happens, they need to zip into a burrow. So they have very definite areas that they navigate. So when you take them and put them somewhere else, they have no clue what to do, and they try to go back home. You would too. If I were to take you from your home and drop you somewhere else, you'll try your utmost to go back home. And that's a very fundamental animal need. It transcends humans. It transcends elephants. It's even in bumblebees. So when animals try to do that, when you take them out of their homes and they try to come back, they mostly die. So 75% is the thumb rule that we use. 75% of animals that are moved out of their homes die. And it's a slow process of death. It could be starvation, they could be bumbling around, crossing streets when they are not looking properly because they are half not paying attention. And, or they could get killed by their rivals. It happens. So should one be worried about snakes then? So in India, close to 50,000 people are killed by them a year. It's the highest in the world. So should we be talking about saving snake lives when so many humans are paying the cost of having snakes there? Now, in the 19th century, in British India, there was a governor, or I don't know what the name of the post was. The guy decided that lots of people were dying from cobra bite, and he was going to exterminate cobras. And British India at that time had this similar vermin program to exterminate tigers and various other creatures that they called vermin, and cobras became one of them. So people were asked to bring in dead snakes and claim a bounty. Fabulous. That ought to have killed all the snakes outright, right? But that's not what happened, because some enterprising humans decided they would breed cobras. Don't ask me how, because I have no idea. I can't find the original source. So then when the administration found out what was going on, they scrapped the program. Now there are all these guys stuck with all these snakes. What are they going to do? They released them. So there were even more snakes than when they started. So now economics uses this phrase. You spoke of the butterfly effect. There's a Cobra effect. So when you try to solve a problem and make it worse, it's called the Cobra effect. So what happens, so even if you declare a bounty, people and nature have a way of not behaving according to the laws in very simple and straightforward cause and effect fashion. So they have a way of confounding you. And so killing doesn't quite work. And we also have the example from China, where they decided to kill all the sparrows, and there was a massive famine because locusts descended on their crops, and there were no birds to eat the insects. So you could have that other unintended consequence. The other more thing that happens is that when people see a snake, they think it has just come there for the first time ever. It's strayed from somewhere. But actually, that snake has probably lived there for 4 or 5 years, and it just happened to make a mistake that particular day. It just happened to show up in the wrong place at the wrong time. So if you remove that snake, people say, now there are no snakes here, and they continue living a life without taking any precautions. And that is very risky, because when you have rodents, another snake is going to take that space. Where there is one snake, there are others. And very soon, there will be another snake, and it could be, like, let's say first you had a rat snake. It's a non-venomous snake. It's a rodent eater, and it grows very large. Let's say you remove it because you don't like the idea of living with a snake. You just don't care for that kind of lifestyle. So you have the snake removed. The next snake that comes to occupy that space could be a cobra. So you have a real, literal Cobra Effect. So in trying to solve a small problem, you've brought a bigger problem. And you wouldn't even know that there's a cobra there. And you might be, walking barefoot, you've lived there all your life, you put your hands and feet where without even seeing what you're doing, and you could get bit. And also, when a new creature comes into a new place, it doesn't know what's there. It has to explore. And a resident cobra or any snake knows you by smell. It'll know your habits over time. It knows what time you wake up, what time you go to bed, what you're doing, when to expect. So it adjusts its routine to your routine, and that's how they have survived that long. So a new creature comes in, it has no idea what your routine is, and it's going to have to explore and learn. And so you have a snake taking a high-risk acting in a high-risk fashion, and you have humans behaving in a high-risk fashion, and you put the two together, and you have a problem. So you know where I'm leading to. I'm going to say, yeah, you're going to have to live with snakes. Okay, fine, non-venomous snake, you could. I know from your faces that it's not a very digestible idea, but you could do it. But what do you do with a venomous snake? How can you live with venomous snakes? We don't really know. I don't have an answer because there is no research that shows us how we do it. But there are examples. There are 2 villages we know, 2 communities we know of, one in West Bengal and one in the state near Baramati, where people have cobras living in their houses and have no problem. I have no idea how they do it. We don't know how they adjust, and we need research to know what are the ways in which they can avoid it. And it's not even in a slum in Bangalore. A friend of mine who is a snake rescuer was called to remove a cobra from a hut. And it wasn't the woman who living in the hut who had called them, it was the neighbor who had seen a cobra go into her house, and he called the rescuer, and he shows up, and the lady was at home, and she said, no, I know these cobras, I don't want you to catch them. I just shoo them away with my broom. And this is Bangalore city. So, yeah, so it's really hard to, so the one thing you can do, one thing people can do to reduce, at least reduce the risk of getting bit is making sure you don't encourage rats. So for snakes, the smell of rats is like the attar of roses. And they're following that sense of smell. You clear your house, your surroundings of that smell, and snakes aren't going to like you very much. So that means, cleaning up, hygienic spaces we were talking about earlier, and making sure there aren't piles of debris, holes where rats and snakes can take refuge, using a light, and most importantly, there are just four common venomous snakes that kill all these 50,000 people. And they are very easy to identify. Just learn to identify them, because everything else is a non-venomous snake. Everything else. You don't have to worry about them. It's on YouTube. That is a video. So the other big reason we need to do this is because of climate change. I talk about climate change, and I'm not usually a climate change person, but if climate change is going to cause more frequent and more extreme weather patterns, like the floods in Kerala, or like the heat wave that we had last year or the year before, snakes come out. And now there are one hospital in Kerala has reported 50 snake bites just from the flooding. And that's because they're getting flushed out of their holes and crawling into people's houses for refuge. And we don't really know what to do with them because they've been displaced, but people are also suffering. What do we do with these snakes? And if you remove all these snakes, could you have a rodent explosion like what happened in China after the sparrows got exterminated? So we really don't know what the implications are of this whole ecology of rodent, snake, human cycle in the urban scenario. At least in rural areas, the snakes are more in the agricultural fields, but in rural areas, they are very much in people's homes in close quarters with lots and lots of people. So I don't really have an answer, but since your email came in the middle of my preoccupation, I'm just sharing that with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Janaki. Thank you for bringing in something as concrete as snakes, and concrete and physical, and yet something as symbolic and metaphysical, really, because what you are opening up here is really the question of fear, of disgust, and their relationship with violence and killing. And this is the link that I see, for instance, between talking about snakes, or talking about women, or talking about Dalits. For instance, in Milton's Paradise Lost, Eve's hair replicates the serpentine, labyrinthine quality of snakes. And I therefore wonder whether we have moved from one kind of division and duality, the break or the rupture in language, to another, which is the duality, to use Keats's terms, between truth and beauty, between order and messiness. And, is nature ugly and messy and unpredictable and lawless, or is nature simple and elegant and beautiful? And what are our investments in this kind of binaried, divided thinking? And how would art, how would science, how would writing align itself? How would politics, how would social theory align itself to this binary of order and disorder, messiness and elegance? And with that idea, which I see linking the latter half of this panel, I want to open it out to the audience. Yes. Yes. Annapurna, then Akhil, then Ravi. And then go to that half.
Mukul, I want to thank...
It's a longer session, so,
Mukul, thank you for your paper. I think that it's a very important thing that you put into the middle of this conversation. So I'm a historian, art historian, architectural historian, and I work on, my PhD thesis was on the Karnataka part of the Deccan, especially around the area of Hampi and further. And when the Vijayanagara kings came there, they introduced wet agriculture, really intense wet agriculture in a very dry area. And they built large systems of reservoirs using corvée labor, what you talked about, and the sluices were designed as temples. As temples, temple towers. So each sluice had this temple tower. When the Vijayanagara king's rule came to an end, the tanks dried up, but the temples, the sluices were converted into real temples. And they housed goddesses like Renuka and all these Dalit goddesses, because it's those communities that stayed when the kings left, right? So that's one interesting thing. There's a scholar named Isha Shah who was researching in these areas, and I helped her translate some of these local stories about tanks. And when the British were introducing it was her stuff, and we had a conversation about it, her research. And when they were introducing tank construction in areas like Bijapur, overnight, they were forced to do this work. Overnight, they would be dismantled, right? Recently, there's been a whole bunch of activity because of a scientist from Kerala who is understanding Sultanate period water systems that are underground. And that kind of revived all the wells in Bidar, Gulbarga, Bijapur. So what I'm offering you, maybe, is that there's peace with nature for the Dalits and for the people who live in marginal landscapes. It's just that we have to find a way to use certain kinds of technology or knowledge in new ways, with new politics of labor or just new ways. I don't have a word more than that. I don't think it's necessary that the Vodars have to become Vodars in order to make all these tanks. It's not possible. That knowledge is gone. But we still need the water. Everybody needs the water. That's all I want to say.
Oh, really thankful. I am a great admirer of Isha Shah's work, as well as the work of David Morse. Good that you reaffirm those references. So I will be happy to continue working in this area. In a different context, the way you are giving reference of Karnataka, Bijapur and all, suppose in Gujarat, is a similar kind of story to make tanks and ponds. And there is a very strong cultural symbol of Mayaville, who sacrificed his life to create a deep, long pond. And that has become a very strong environmental symbol also among Dalit environmental politics, which is of course not part of the overall environmental symbolism. So yeah, there are these examples, and I will be very happy to share with you and continue working with this.
I just want to remind the audience that your questions and comments can be addressed to all the speakers this afternoon, so not just the second half. Akhil.
So a question for Ram and for Janaki. Ram, just a couple of things. You know, Galileo, whom you cited, and I'm just curious about how this fits in with your understanding of this range of people until you came to chaos theory and so on, and non-linearity, where they look for a few laws, as few as possible, say. So, and that's completely understandable, because if you explain a lot of things by a few things, the explanation is that much more powerful. Right? I mean, if for each explanandum you had a different explanation, the explanation would be virtually trivial, right? So that's a completely methodologically understandable aspiration for. But Galileo, as you know, declared color to be, I mean, it's a very famous passage and really remarkable passage, had a great influence. Said color doesn't figure in fundamental physics. There is no color. The world does not consist of colors from the point of view of natural science. You know, as science gets more and more fundamental, right? So in cognitive science, of course, color figures because we see it, but that's a special science. But in the fundamental sciences, so physics basically, which was his subject, there's no color, right? So there are shapes, there are sizes, there's mass and so on, but there's no color. Now that's a breathtaking reduction, right? I mean, if you're seeking reduction, it's an astonishing thing to say that that platform is brown is not describing reality. It's just an impertinence from the point of view of any understanding of reality to be told that that statement is not describing reality, right? So how do you figure that? Because see, it doesn't fit in with your, it's got nothing to do with random, right? It's got nothing to do with nonlinearity. It's nothing to do with endless or infinite recursiveness. No, it's just sheer elimination from reality. So it doesn't fit in quite with all of your, exceptional things like randomness, nonlinearity, etc.
No, true. See, but the point is, Akhil, I mean, I would date really, quantitative modern science from the time of Newton, who famously did not only believe in color, but also did a lot of experiments in color. I think that you're right about the Galilean explanation. It is by elimination. Since the color of a ball doesn't depend on how fast it falls, then color must be an irrelevant attribute. And that's sort of the best kind of explanation one can give. Galileo was, I mean, he stopped short of enunciating sort of fairly major laws, although, I mean, of course, he did a very major law, but he discovered inertia, for example, and, so he did that. But the quantification, which is what I was appealing to as the beginning of the physical sciences in some sense, the quantification didn't actually come until Newton. So I would just leave Galileo out of the...
No, I understand, but even for Newton, right, color was entirely supervenient on corpuscles.
Yes.
Right? The fundamental things was corpuscles. It wasn't... Right. So, but what I'm asking is, what methodological urge does it gratify that you should be wanting to say that because you can understand color, because a certain configuration of what they called corpuscles, we would now call atoms or whatever, or molecules or
photons.
Right, but so if every time there is brown, there is this configuration of corpuscles or whatever, what is the compulsion to say, therefore, this is not really brown, it's just a bunch of corpuscles? You see, it isn't fitting in with all your other stuff about randomness and so on. I just don't understand the basis of that compulsion, and I've never understood it. What is the urge it gratifies? What theoretical urge does it gratify?
No, I think that any proper answer would require much more thought and reflection. But, maybe the answer is somewhere there in Goethe, where he had his own theory of colors and attributes. So,
I have a theory.
Big one?
I have a theory.
Yes.
I'm almost willing to wager Galileo was colorblind. I think Galileo was colorblind. No, I'm not joking. My husband's colorblind, and he's a snake person. And I can't see green snakes and green plants. He can, because he trusts only shapes, which is exactly what Galileo was saying. So I have a suspicion that he was colorblind. He didn't trust it.
Colorblindness, Janaki, is only usually 2 colors or 3 colors.
No, but there are
it's
variations.
Not like all colors.
There are variations. There's like 4 different.
No, I think the explanation, or there may be this explanation, but others might be there which require a little more reflection on.
I did have, but I've spoken too long. I think it should go.
Would you like to? I have a question for Mukul. Thank you for that, Mukul. I wonder if when you think of intersection of caste and gender, about Dalit women within Dalit societies, how does that play out? Because that's another layer of structure. And also so that's one thing of what you want to say. And then Sheba talks about why people don't act, and maybe something to do with purity and pollution. The idea of caste is so deeply ingrained in the way we see nature and natural systems that the story of this landlord willing to sleep with a Dalit woman but won't eat from a hand because we ingest something, you defile your body. And then ask a question to Ram about when you explain what color. that if theoretically one thinks of a completely different sensory perception system, which is not human, would the laws of nature have a completely different pattern? Suppose you can only sense energy, and you had no eyes, and but body senses, you could not the way we feel it, or it flows through your body differently. Will the laws of nature be completely different? In which case, they're not really laws of nature. There are our perceptions of a pattern we define nature as.
If I can just take the mic because it's close to me. There is this very interesting idea by Hamming where he says that there are colors that we cannot see because there are wavelengths which are smaller or larger than our eyes can sense. There are sounds that we cannot hear. Are there thoughts that we cannot think? Are there ideas and thoughts that we are incapable of thinking?
But can I say something? May I, Mr. Chairman? That really is a very interesting thing. If you take physical abilities, right, it is obvious that if you have some physical abilities, just in virtue of having them, you can't have others. Just in virtue of having the ability you have, you can't have others. So if I can walk, I cannot slither like a snake, right? Just by the fact that I can walk, I cannot slither like a snake. Now, if that's true of physical abilities, why on earth shouldn't it be true of cognitive abilities? I mean, there's no reason why it should not equally be true of other abilities, and not just physical ability. And that's what you're really asking. Yeah, it's exactly like that.
And hence, if you could only sense energy and whatnot, there would be a systematization which we don't have access to now.
No, you also have.
After you. Just thinking about purity pollution, women are particularly subject to these taboos. And for me, it's another example of what I'm calling the separation from the body, dematerialization, disembodiment. So while in one part of the country you have the goddess menstruates, the cloth that is offered to her is distributed as prasad. In other parts, a woman who is menstruating cannot enter a temple. So purity pollution is yet another example, and it's completely intertwined with caste hierarchies, of this distancing, of the dematerialization. So if one speaks of the category woman as being seguing into the category nature, a lot of this, the attitude of, in relation to waste, because it is the waste products of the body that are polluting. That is the first level of pollution, and then it gets socialized and hierarchicalized into other forms. I think there's something to be explored there, because any place you go, even in one of the most crowded slums or bastis in Delhi, which I'm most familiar with, the inner part of the house will be spotless, and all the dirt is put out. And there's this fundamental thing of what is your own personal space, which is kept clean, pure, and pollution belonging in a way to the commons. So these are things that can be thought about, but they're interesting links which I think go across both caste and gender.
So, Ravi, to answer your question, I think you need to invite me for another seminar. So, because gender, caste, and nature is a topic I have just started working on. And that's why I have no definite answer. I have just collected the songs by Dalit women in the agricultural field in Jharkhand and Bihar. Now, certainly there are many common things, because it's not only Dalit women, Dalit men are also agricultural workers, they're also landlords, they are landless, they're also bonded. But whether there is anything to differentiate, to highlight the gender viewpoint, I haven't actually worked. So it's an area to work. So that's it.
Yeah. I'm actually kind of not ashamed to pronounce that I like snakes. And I have a kind of, I have a snake map that from South 24 Parganas, I happily, proudly, kind of flaunt, like, they show it to people. And then people are really intrigued. Every time, like, I put it there, like, the first thing they enter the home and then go there and then venomous snakes, non-venomous snakes. And there is a kind of revelation in front of people. Oh, there's actually non-venomous snakes. But quickly, and also, South 24 Pargana is basically Sundarban region. Like, obviously, you know, one of the kind of places for snake, and then the huge snake bite. And then, but still, traditionally, there is a saga still flowing there, Mansa, the snake goddess, that she is being worshipped also in some parts in South 24 Parganas in the cities. It's still continuing, and then which is being worshipped by what we call so-called subaltern people. So it's not necessarily that always it's a kind of conflicting relationship. There is a conflict and also at the same time a certain kind of mutual thing. And quickly, I don't know, it is directly relevant, your point reminded me of that, like, you don't know how people lived with cobras and all this. It reminded me of my father that was a partition refugee, and then from East Bengal, which was again that water, riverine place and all this. And I've grown up with listening to stories of snakes entering into and leaving inside because they used to sleep on mud floor, and there was always a couple snakes and cobras also. So there were kind of rules, codes, and if I remember rightly, like they used to keep a bamboo basket because they knew if middle of the night, like it's sin, that like it will cover it with that, and a stick, not for killing necessarily. It's also to scare away, and before going to sleep, they used to kind of beat the floor. These two I just remembered, like suddenly I thought that's it.
Sorry, just I was just curious, and if it's too obvious and silly, don't answer, Ram. But your image that you had on when you in the beginning and with Mandelbrot, would you suppose if you had gone on for another half an hour, would you have connected up with, say, Nagarjuna and Buddhist thought and interconnectedness and another understanding of ecology?
I wouldn't have, mostly because I don't know very much about Buddhist thought and so on, but this idea of recursivity and this idea that the whole becomes, there is a homunculus, if you like, within the homunculus, in sort of in a value-free description. That is the kind of imagery that these fractals have, made us very sensitive to. And I think it's really a question of detail. So, I tend, all right, so my thing about this imagery was more to tell you that reality is not as simple as our ancients thought in the description, but what really is there, the chaos or the nonlinearity, is also elegant in its own way. I mean, and that was part of the idea of these images, is that there is symmetry there. It's a more complicated symmetry, but there is a symmetry there, and there is a beauty over there, which is sort of made enhanced by adding colors to things that don't really have color, and, these sets and so on and so forth. So, more or less, my point is that we look for aesthetic and minimal explanations, whether it is in describing the physical world or even perhaps the metaphysical world. We would like somewhat elegant and simple explanations.
But isn't this fractal theory in a simplistic way actually beautifully non-hierarchical?
Beautifully?
Non-hierarchical in terms of how one would to understand all existence.
Okay, the slightly different use of the word hierarchical, because I would have used hierarchical to describe the organization, but I see what you mean. That is the same structure within the structure within the structure. Yeah.
Fearful symmetry.
So I wanted to ask a question that hopefully will bring, all of your things were amazing, but to bring questions that Ram brought up and Janaki brought up together about entanglement and mutually constitutive, let's say, intra-actional causality within the natural world in relation to the human. And they use the natural world in quotes as a complicated topic. But I'm thinking of things like quantum entanglements, all the way down to the kind of entanglement that Janaki discussed with and the Cobra Effect, or the unintended consequences of every time we try to interfere in these complex, nonlinear, emergent natural systems, we make a bigger problem, or a problem that we don't know how to deal with, at least, because we are so entangled. And as I'm listening to these, I think that I loved the wonderfully grounded story of the Cobra, because actually you could transpose this same story onto any number of apex predators, for example. Certainly wolves in the American context, and also in many other places. I think you could tell exactly the same kind of story, actually. And so thinking about the larger implications of this question of entanglement in relation to what is the human and the more than humans relationship, and what modes of co-engagement or world making then can we may perhaps start to try to think about in a more conscious way with respect to these entanglements, made me really think that we need to talk more about what would constitute ecological modes of citizenship, or what I'll talk about tomorrow is a sort of multi-species polity, in which our implicatedness, our mutual consequentiality that forms the ground condition of our living together is a kind of existential necessity that we simply cannot actually exit from, and that we need to take into account much more, in a much more sophisticated way and with more respect for the dynamism of these systems. So maybe if there's a way to talk about the bridging of these entanglements from the much more abstract mathematical and physical world to the very concrete interspecies relationships, I'd be really love to hear your thoughts.
That's very provocative, Maya. So let me just say just a few random thoughts about it. See, the quantum entanglement is a lot more complex, and I wouldn't want to say too much about that right now, other than that chaos does play a role of the kind that we talked about, or I sort of briefly alluded to. The central message of the latter part of what I wanted to say is just this. The real world out there is messy, it is complicated, and it is nonlinear in the sense that small changes today can have huge consequences, could have huge consequences in the future. Which also means that some small changes in the past have had huge consequences now. For example, our existence. The world has not been a smooth and nice system until we came along and messed it up. It was always messy. And, we are here so much by chance. I mean, if that meteor had not hit the Yucatan, there would still be dinosaurs on Earth. They were very, very successful. So our being here and our, is really a consequence of these kinds of random, chaotic events. And I think we should also realize our place, therefore, in this entire world, in the grand scheme of things. We are here for a short while. I mean, all of humanity is here for a really short while, right? And just the idea that that the world is a complex place and that nonlinearity happens, it could guide some of the things that we do, and that's really what I think the message of what, trying to bridge these two worlds, that's what I'd like to convey.
As I was listening to this, I was looking around, and I was seeing these very neatly hung rectangles, this grid of art. But what is in the rectangles is the messiness and irreverence and randomness and violence of life and of nature and of flesh and of imagination and of thought. And I've been fascinated with this whole notion of grids, and I was looking at the etymology of the word grid, and it goes back to the gridiron, the iron metal frame on fire on which meat was burned and martyrs were tortured. So there is a relationship between burning flesh and torture and grids. So order, the orderliness of grid, and the violence and the messiness and the succulence of burning flesh, I think, come together in that wonderful, sort of, yes. And Rohini, do you want to ask a question, or are you just stretching yourself? Okay, yes. A comment, yes.
Sorry, that was just such a wonderful panel, and I just wanted to share something. We were talking about what Ravi and Akhil mentioned briefly, and then Ram did as well, that perhaps there are some thoughts that we just can't think, or some, if we have certain attributes and there are others that are automatically, and then non-linearity. It just made me think that there's a wonderful science fiction movie that is called Arrival, which is based on a book as well. And the movie is about first contact, which is not unusual, but it's from the point of view of a linguist who is brought in because the aliens, who are called the heptapods, don't speak a language. They communicate through hieroglyphs, which are circular, and no one can understand this. And then what happens is that over the course of the movie, you realize that the language is non-linear, and this woman, as she starts to understand this language, starts to have these flashes that you think are flashbacks. I don't want to actually, it's a spoiler alert actually, but essentially it rewires her brain, and then you realize that she's actually looking into her future and her past simultaneously, because that's what the aliens can do. So it was just, I just thought it just made me think of that, yeah.
The movie, and thank you for the spoiler.
Sorry. I know, it's a great movie. You should definitely watch it.
So maybe we can end this evening's session. Thank you very much, Martin. In my great nervousness before I began moderating this, I forgot my note of thanks to you and to Amrita and to everybody here and to all of you here. Thank you very much. And we will look forward to tomorrow.